More than 235 people are now reported to have been killed in that militant attack on a crowded mosque in Egypt. The Egyptian president is holding an emergency security meeting. The assault happened in the northern Sinai region when armed men stormed the building and detonated a bomb during Friday prayers. It's the deadliest attack in the 3-year insurgency in Sinai. Well, Sally Nabil is in Cairo and gave us the latest.
It's by all means an unprecedented attack, whether when it comes to casualty numbers or the style of the attack. As you said, there are 235 people killed and more than 100 injured, and we understand that some of the wounded are in a quite critical condition, so perhaps the death toll might keep rising over the next few hours. And when it comes to the style of the attack, it's the first time that the militants target worshippers inside a mosque. Over the past couple of years, militants have been operating in northern Sinai. They mainly target military forces, police forces, Christians as well. They obliged so many Christians to flee their homes for fear of their lives. But this is the first time that they do target worshippers inside a mosque. They were going to Friday prayers, Friday noon prayers, which is a religious obligation. So many men accompanying their children, they went to the mosque, and as they were about to finish, a bomb went off not far from the mosque. And after that, a group of militants armed with automatic rifles, they walked inside the mosque and they shot at every single person they saw. And outside the mosque, we understand that there was another group of militants, and they started shooting at passers-by. They also targeted ambulances that rushed to the scene to try and help and save the victims. And this kind of orchestrated attack explains why the number of victims is so high. We know that 50 ambulance cars have rushed to the attack scene to try and move the wounded to nearby hospitals, and some people on Twitter, they have been asking people to donate blood to save lives.
Terrorist attacks not unknown, obviously, of course, in Egypt, but we're talking about a particularly remote area and a tribal area.
Yes, northern Sinai is a remote tribal area, and it's also worth mentioning that it's very difficult to verify things inside northern Sinai because the area has been living under a total media blackout for the past couple of years. The only way we can get pictures is via social media. No media organizations have been allowed to go inside Sinai. Even the state-sponsored media have been stopped from going. So there is a lot going on. Militants have been gaining ground over the past couple of years. Although military forces say every now and then they release statements saying that they managed to hit hard on the militant groups, the IS-affiliated militant groups operating in different parts of the peninsula. But so far it seems that the operation is still going on, and the military forces, they have to exert more effort to try and put an end to this insurgency taking place there.
The president is holding an emergency cabinet meeting, but there may well be criticism of the government because we're talking about an area where there was very little security.
Yes, there is some criticism for the government. 3 days of national mourning have been announced, but on the other hand, in addition to criticism, there are some people who kept asking questions like, this is just a mosque. How can you impose a security cordon or provide security for every single mosque or every single church in the area? I mean, it's not a military building or a police building, so these were just defenseless civilians going to Friday prayers. But on the other hand, there are some people who criticize the military and the intelligence for not doing enough to try to put an end to this insurgency, which has been going on for more than 3 years now. And it seems that the government has to look into taking tougher measures to try to confront what's happening there.
Sally Nabil.
President Trump getting tough on terror after more than 300 worshippers were killed at an Egyptian mosque. On Twitter, the president made a renewed call for the wall and a travel ban, his travel ban, to keep America safe. So here with more on all of that, senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, Rebecca Heinrichs. Rebecca, thanks for coming in on this holiday weekend. Appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
So what do you make of the President Trump's tweet? An appropriate time to be calling for his wall and travel ban?
Yeah, I mean, what he's talking about is he wants to keep the border safe for the United States. And we've got this war against Islamist extremism, and it doesn't really have borders. It can, it travels in the minds of people. And so we've seen this, the terrorist attack in Egypt, of course. Al-Sisi is trying to crack down. He's trying to, he's got a multiple front of Islamists who are causing problems from al-Qaeda and ISIS. And so what President Trump really needs to do at this point is demonstrate the solidarity and support with Sisi, with the Sisi government, as it tries to work with neighboring countries. It's working with the Israelis to try to crack down on what we're seeing is this ISIS increasingly growing in the Sinai Peninsula.
So President Trump spoke with the Egyptian president yesterday, offered his support, but do you believe that he needs to be doing more, offering even more support to the Egyptian president?
The United States does supports, I believe it's the second greatest military aid package that goes to the Egyptians next to the Israelis. And this year, it was interesting, the State Department announced we're going to be withholding some of the aid we generally give on the condition because of some human rights violations of Sisi. This goes sort of crossways with what the Trump administration has been doing, which is saying that the best thing we can do for human rights is to counter Islamist radicals. And until we can combat Islamist radicals, we're not going to be able to deal with human rights problems. So, I really think the Trump administration needs to square this circle. Even Rex Tillerson has said that we're not going to put human rights first. We're going to crack down on Islamists. And so it doesn't really make sense. So if the Trump administration is serious about this, I would recommend that they go back to the State Department and look at what they're doing and saying and back fully the Sisi government so that he can do what needs to be done to protect minorities. He's been protecting the Coptic Christians, which account for about 10% of the population, but there are about 90% of the Christians there, and protect these Muslim, groups that are in minorities and that are peaceful. And so the Trump administration really needs to take a look at this aid package again.
We know that a lot of these attackers were carrying ISIS flags, but we've heard so much about ISIS being on its heels. What does this attack in Egypt, the worst in the country's history, say to you about ISIS's capabilities, even though it's been hit back so much in recent weeks and months?
Sure. As the United States and our allies really crack down in Iraq and in Syria, you're going to see ISIS move. And so what we're looking at now is perhaps because of this uptick in attacks in the Sinai, that perhaps they've just moved and they're trying to hold and take territory there. That's why it's in the U.S. interest to cooperate with Sisi and to make sure that this doesn't become the next widespread battleground.
So switching gears to Saudi Arabia and Iran, this has become such a huge hotspot in recent days after the Saudis charged Iran with an act of war. A missile came very close to the Saudi capital. How hot is this getting?
Well, it's getting hot. And again, during the Obama administration, one of the sort of centerpieces of the Obama foreign policy was to legitimize Iran and to sort of, before it was isolated. And now they try to legitimize the Iran. That's why you had the Iran deal. And as a result, the Iranians were flush with cash, and it continued to support terrorism throughout the region. One of the groups it supports are the Houthi rebels in Yemen. That's the group responsible for shooting this missile towards the Saudis. Thankfully, the Saudis have a missile defense system, their Patriot batteries that the United States made, and they intercepted the missile, which is remarkable. But again, this is we're dealing with now sort of the fallout of the Obama foreign policy. And so the Trump administration is trying to embolden now Iran's adversaries, which are the Saudis, and corner Iran again and sort of isolate them to sort of, try to dry up some of these funds that it's using to terrorize the region.
Well, and you also had this week the Saudi crown prince calling Iran's supreme leader the new Hitler of the Middle East. I mean, that's a pretty bold accusation. Do you think we're going to hear anything from the White House about that?
Well, the Iranians, they still are run by this Islamist ideology, the IRGC, that the Treasury Department has now said it supports terrorism. They're anti-Israel. They paint death to Israel on their missiles when they test missiles. So it makes sense that this regime would be compared to another anti-Jewish regime, and it certainly makes sense.
Well, and the Saudi crown prince saying that Iran needs to be confronted. So pretty hot region. Thank you so much for being with us, Rebecca. Appreciate it.
And President Trump renewing his call for the travel ban and border wall after the mosque attack that killed more than 300 people in Egypt. He also tweeted this: "The world cannot tolerate terrorism. We must defeat them militarily and discredit the extremist ideology that forms the basis of their existence. Exclamation point. Joining me now is our Asia analyst, Gordon Chang. He's the author of Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World. Always great to have you here, Gordon.
Thanks, Laura.
So obviously, we've got a lot to digest with what has happened over these last few days. So as we watch this horrific situation in Egypt unfold, 305 people dead in this. You know, it is so hard to look at this story, to think about the children. Let's just start with, what do you think about President Trump's tweets on this?
I think he was absolutely correct when he talked about militarily defeating the terrorists. You know, Egyptian President al-Sisi actually talked about the same thing. He said, what we need to do is use brute force. In the Pentagon, they talk about winning hearts and minds and 3 cups of tea, but the terrorists obviously believe that this is a military matter. They're using guns and explosives, and we should view it in the same way. Now, you know, we defeated in large measure ISIS in the sense of taking their caliphate and shrinking it to really a very small portion of Syria and Iraq. And now these terrorists are going all over the place, and because of that, you have the incidents like the one in Egypt. But over time, I think that the ISIS is going to lose its allure because it lost militarily at Raqqa and Mosul and other places.
Right. And, you know, as we do track the movements and actions of ISIS overseas, at times it seems as though things might be, you know, kind of settling down in some regard. But then you have this event that happened, and you mentioned losing their footing in Raqqa. We've got the mosque attack. So what do you think the real story is? You know, in terms of the numbers and the power and the strength that is going on right now with ISIS, where are we really?
Well, I think that we're winning, but obviously this is something where you can't declare final victory because you no longer have that big caliphate. You no longer have what looks like a nation state. This threat is going to metastasize. You're going to see fighters spreading not only through Egypt and the Levant and also Europe and the United States, but these are not going to have the same force. You know, people will die. And that's, of course, you know, something that we're going to try and prevent. But nonetheless, you know, ISIS is not going to have that same allure. And when it doesn't have that allure, the attacks, I think, will eventually shrivel.
You know, we watch these tweets, we watch the news, we listen for the words of the president. And when we hear things like he wants to crush terrorists with military means, what does that look like in terms of military personnel, placement, and the weapons? What exactly are we talking about when we see those words? Yeah,
I think what it means is we're going to have more military personnel in Syria. You know, there's a dispute as how many we have there now, maybe as many as 7,000. That number may have to go up. We're going to have to do these things. You know, in 2014, in January, when President Obama said that ISIS was the JV, you know, and we had reduced our footprint in Iraq, well, ISIS became a real threat. They actually established a caliphate. It looked like it had a lot of territory, controlled a lot of money, oil and the rest of it, and it was only through military action that we were able to shrink that along with the countries that we're working with. So unfortunately, we're going to have more people there. You know, we don't want to do that. That's politically unpopular, but we see what happens when presidents do politically popular things. These threats grow.
Right. And in terms of how this is playing out overseas, how do you think the president's words on terrorism is playing out? When he condemned the mosque attack, he reiterated that the United States will continue to stand with Egypt in the face of terrorism. How does that translate into action? How is it perceived around the world?
In Egypt, I'm sure it's going to be taken very well. In Saudi Arabia, another friend, it will be taken well. Countries like Iran are not going to like it. You know, they fuel some of this terrorism with their links with Hezbollah. So, you know, if you're not a friend of the U.S., you're not going to like the president's tweet. You know, a lot of people would like to see this thing as being sort of, you know, we do this by making sure that people love us. Well, unfortunately, that's not the way to deal with this. The way to deal with this is to win on the battlefield. You kill the enemy, you capture them, or you force them into retirement. That's an unfortunate reality, but that's the way it is.
What was your reaction when you first saw the news on the mosque? When you woke up, when we all woke up and we heard what happened and we saw the numbers begin to rise and to this great number of over 300?
Yeah, it's horrific, and we never get used to it,
right.
Regardless of what happens, because you see the children and the rest of it. This is just something that is going to shake us to our core as long as it continues.
It has to stop.
Has to stop.
It has to stop. Well, hopefully we will have some sort of resolution. We will have, you know, some answers here as we move forward with this unfortunate story. Gordon Chang, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thanks, Laura.
Appreciate it.